This is an iPhone 7 camera lens. To be more accurate, it's my iPhone 7 camera lens, and as you can see, it's cracked and scratched up, and it has been for a long time. That's just kind of inherent in the design of a phone that has a camera bump. So what I'm going to do is show you one method that you can use to replace this lens. Now, there are easier ways to do this. However, the reason I chose this specific procedure is because I wanted to retain my phone's IP rating. And if you just pull the glass off and stick a new one on top of there, you're probably going to have not quite exactly what you got from the factory when it comes to sealing moisture out of the phone and definitely out of the camera. So this will be much more involved, and it's not necessarily an easy repair, but if you're interested in doing it, here's one way you can. So the first thing we're going to have to do is make sure that we have the correct part. On the little baggie there on the left hand side, you can see I have my camera lens with a small piece attached to it that comes with it. You can also see I have a blinking logo, so when you see things inside of my phone that don't look exactly the way that yours do, it's because there's one extra piece of hardware on the inside, and that shouldn't affect your ability to perform this repair, but it will explain why you'll see just an extra cable that's kind of plugged in underneath my battery. So I'll start by turning the phone off. That's always going to be our first priority. And then, of course, once we get it opened up, we will disconnect the battery on the inside to make sure that there is no power flowing through the phone anywhere or any potential to short anything out or cause any other problems. So your two pentalobe screws there on the bottom are the first ones that come out. If you need a more in-depth tutorial on screen removal, there are many available. I'm going to focus here on just getting this thing apart so that we can remove the actual camera lens assembly. Now, sometimes you can use a suction cup and kind of pull up on the screen towards the bottom end just slightly enough to get a pry tool in between the panel where your display is and the frame of the phone itself. But this is a phone that has already had the factory adhesive replaced with what appears to be an even stronger aftermarket waterproof seal. So I just ended up going ahead and using my razor blade, as I often do, to open up the phone. You don't have to do this, obviously, but razor blades are very thin and they get into very small areas. And of course, as soon as I can, I switch over to a softer plastic blade, and I'm just going to make a very shallow pry along the edge of the screen on both sides and on the bottom. You can't really go across the top too much because there are some latches in there that will prevent you from going too far, but that's not going to be a problem. And by the way, that razor blade that I used, it has been dulled down so that it's not very sharp. It's still thin and it's still strong enough to get underneath the screen, but they're pretty unlikely you're going to cut anything as long as you don't push it in there more than about 1/8 of an inch or so, maybe even 1/16. So as you can see, the adhesive is starting to separate from the phone, but we need to keep in mind that we have these latches up at the top end. So you'll see in just a second here, what I'm going to do is take another pry tool. This is a plastic playing card, and I'm just kind of making sure that both sides are separated. You don't really need two separate tools for this, but if you have them available, it certainly doesn't hurt. And I do this in order to make sure that the adhesive doesn't stick to itself again or back to the frame or the screen or whatever it is you happen to be working with. So once we have these separated enough that we can grab a hold of them, you're going to just lift it slightly away from the housing, and then you're going to slide the entire assembly down towards the bottom end where the home button is. So the reason that we do that is because, as you'll see here shortly, there are these little plastic latches that go underneath the top of the screen. If you don't know that, you're going to have some problems. And of course, this phone does not open from the bottom end. It opens up from what would be the left-hand side if you were looking at it upright. So I'm just kind of wiggling this thing back and forth a bit. And as it starts to loosen up here, you'll see that I take a slightly thicker pry tool and just kind of get in between the top end of the screen so it will shift down towards the bottom end. I'm going to say maybe, again, probably about 1/8 of an inch at the most, and then we'll be able to go ahead and open this up. You can see there's still a bit of adhesive holding it, but those latches are actually clear from the top end, so they're not holding the screen on. And from here, we want to be very, very careful and very gentle with everything that we handle inside of this phone. These components are super fragile, very thin, easy to tear, poke holes in, strip out the screws. I mean, there are just a number of reasons why, if you're working on an iPhone 7, you really should already have plenty of experience working with phones. They're not getting any easier to repair, and they are definitely getting easier to damage in the process. Now, right down here inside the phone, we're going to have a metal panel. I'm going to come in a little closer here so you can see where these 4 screws are. Now, these are tri-lobe screws, so you will need a special screwdriver in order to remove them. And the key to this is to make sure that the driver is seated properly. I actually used 4 different screwdrivers to take out these screws. I used 1 screwdriver for each screw just to confirm in my mind and what I kind of suspected, and that is that most of these screwdrivers work just fine. But if you're careless and you're not really careful and accurate as far as where they're seated, you're going to have problems stripping them out. And as you can see, one of the screwdrivers that I used was a very inexpensive one. It was the Casey brand, and it worked, again, as long as you're careful. So this little metal panel is going to come out, and once it does, we want to disconnect the battery cable. That's going to be this one right here. And once you unplug that, you can just kind of bend it up so that it's vertical. You don't need to worry about this next step, because what I did is I went ahead and removed my battery and the glowing logo hardware that was underneath it. You definitely don't need to do this. You can leave the battery inside the phone. That's not going to be a problem. I want to make that clear because a lot of times people ask me, like, what'd you take the battery out for? Well, in this case, I was going to make some other changes to the phone, so I wanted to get it out of the way, and you don't need to do that. And you can see this adhesive around the edges. It's like mozzarella cheese. Like, it just doesn't want to break no matter how hard you pull on it. So it'll end up getting wrapped around my screwdriver, and that's not going to be a problem because, of course, we want to replace this once we get done. Now, there are 2 screws that go into this metal panel up here. These are Phillips screws, so make sure that you have the correct driver, that you've changed over from the tri-lobe, and remove those 2 screws. And when you do, there will be a metal panel that was sitting just beneath them. You can usually get a hold of this with your fingers or a pair of tweezers or whatever. It's pretty easy to get out. And once we get that out of the way, we have a couple of cables that we need to disconnect so that we can get the display away from the housing. So be very careful with these. You don't want to ever pry very deep underneath them. I do use the precision tweezers because it makes me be careful about what I'm doing, and that's the same thing you want to do. These cables are super easy to tear. There's one up here at the top also, so 2 at the bottom, 1 at the top. Once those are unplugged, you can take the entire display assembly away, set it off to the side, and now we can focus on what we're going to be doing here. Now, I did end up going ahead and removing the logic board. Right here, I'm going to disconnect the camera cable, and I'll explain that to you in just a second. But after you have this unplugged, there are going to be a couple screws you need to remove, and you may have to go after this one right here with a pair of tweezers. I got it to spin around, but it just didn't want to stick to my screwdriver. So if that's the case, you can always go in and just kind of chase it down with a pair of tweezers. And there will be another screw on the opposite side, diagonal across that panel, and that screw will have to be removed also. And as you can see, that one just did not want to cooperate for whatever reasons. All right, go ahead and get this screw removed from the opposite corner. And did have to go out with the tweezers. Take your tweezers and you can remove this panel from behind the main rear-facing camera. And at this point, you can actually remove the entire camera from the housing. You might have to wiggle it just slightly in order to get it out. But there's nothing really holding it once you remove that bracket and you have it unplugged from the logic board. Now from here, what I did is to take a plastic stick spudger and just push through the lens so that it comes completely out of the phone. So do be careful. Make sure that you don't poke through here and stab yourself in the hand. That would obviously not be fun, even with a piece of plastic. But what we want to do is get the majority of this glass off from here. And it may take a bit of force. So if you want to skip ahead and go ahead and pull the logic board out, we're going to do that anyways. Later into the repair, I kind of realized that would be an easier way to do this, so I did pull the entire board out. It's only a few more screws and a couple cables, but I felt that that was safer than risking doing any damage to the logic board, which is going to become a liability when we start removing the metal plate from the inside. All right, so I've got most of the residual glass removed there. Make sure that you take out your SIM card tray anytime you're going to remove the logic board from your iPhone, because that will always go through the housing and into the board itself. Now we're going to disconnect this cable right over here. Again, be very careful. Make sure you're not putting any pressure on anything when you pry. It's more of a lifting motion than anything else. We have 2 antenna wires down here, and they are actually tucked inside of a small bracket. So once you have these unplugged, you're going to have to kind of route them through that little metal clip, if you want to call it that. All right, so if you get those kind of unwound from there, just push them out of the way and they'll be fine just like that. And then we're going to take our standoff screwdriver. I want to point out this is a special type of driver. It is designed especially for those weird screws that are kind of half Phillips and half slotted. This particular driver so far is my favorite, and there are other ones out there, but this one, in my opinion, seems to work the best. The point in the center is very long, so it seats easily, and it's pretty lightweight and inexpensive and easy to use, so it gets the job done. All right, so we had 2 down here at that bottom end of the logic board near where the battery terminal is. We're going to have 1 up here in the corner. And we're going to disconnect this cable right up here. Just kind of fold that over so it doesn't get stuck on the logic board when we go to pull that out. And then we will have a Phillips right over here next to where that cable is attached. Over here we have a plastic piece that's going to come out. So this one gets a bit complicated. Make sure that you keep track of exactly where these screws came from. The reason this is kind of tricky if you haven't done it many times before is because we have some screws that go into a panel that goes on top of a logic board that has another screw in it. So if you get anything mixed up, it can be a little time consuming. At the very least, it will slow you down trying to figure out where these go. So if you pay very close attention to where they are, or maybe even take a photograph as you're going along so you have something to refer back to. There are 2 that go into this metal panel here that cover up some cables that are attached underneath. And then, of course, we have an oddball one at the top that you'll see here in just a second, where you actually have to change the direction of your screwdriver completely in order to get to it. Now these, as you can see, are the tri-lobe screws. So if you haven't already done so, make sure that you did switch over and use the correct screwdriver. You kind of have to make sure to do this throughout the entire phone for the most part. All right, so there is 1 screw that goes into the top end of the frame here where you have to go in almost at a 90-degree angle to get into it. And I'm going to set that one right there. Okay, we've got 1 more Phillips screw over here. I know it's a little tough to see, but it's right all the way up there in the corner. That one is going to come out, and I'm going to put that in the corner here, just slightly down from what I would call the top. And we're going to disconnect this cable. And go back to our special screwdriver so we can take this one out. Go ahead and remove this little plastic cap. And underneath it, we have another screw to remove. So I would take this one and set it alongside with that plastic piece so that we know that this screw has got to go back in before we put the plastic piece on top. If you can remember that, the rest of it isn't too difficult to figure out. And it will probably take this little piece with it, so that's fine. We can get the whole thing out of the way just like that and just kind of leave the screw inside of it so that way we know where it goes and hopefully can remember what order to put it back in. If not, you can always go back and watch the video and pretty much play it backwards. But from here, if you're very careful about maneuvering around the cables that were plugged into the phone, make sure that you don't get snagged on anything, and you should be able to remove the logic board from the housing. From here, I did not have a good pair of needle nose pliers, so I did a bit of MacGyvering, which I don't like to do, but this tool actually worked out pretty well, so I feel okay with it. I always say use the right tool for the job, but this will actually get the job done without any problems as long as you make sure not to put pressure on anything except for the phone's frame. So I kind of use these almost like a lever in a way, and steady them on the phone's frame while I grabbed a hold of the metal tabs to grip them and basically pull them out of the housing. Once this comes out, you will want to keep that little padded piece of material that's attached to it. We're going to put that back in before we put the phone back together, but the main thing is to make sure that we get this metal plate completely out of the way. I'm not sure what purpose this serves, but so far it doesn't seem to have any negative effects as far as being removed from the phone. And this will very likely break into smaller pieces. Not a big deal. Assume that your warranty is voided, most likely when you break the camera lens if you're trying to get it fixed, but if not, removing this piece would almost definitely void your warranty. Now we're going to pry this little ring out from the housing, and this is the important part. There's a small rubber gasket that goes around the sides of this little piece, and that's got to be transferred to our replacement lens. If you don't have that little rubber gasket in there, you definitely will not have the type of water resistance that you did before, so we want to make sure that that gets moved over. All right, so what we're going to do is just very carefully remove this little rubber piece. You've got to be super careful because if you tear it, I can't tell you where to get another one because I don't know at this point. All right, so that's the piece we were after. Again, I hope it came off all at once for you. If not, you'll have to find another one, and as soon as I figure out where these are available, I'll let you know. But at this point in time, I do not have a supplier. So we want to move this over to the new lens assembly, and it's actually pretty easy to get on, much easier than it was getting it off the old one. All right, so we are good to go there. Now we do need to have something to hold this thing in place. So the rubber gasket will seal out the moisture, but we do need some sort of adhesive in order to hold that lens assembly inside of the frame. I started out using B7000 and found out very shortly after that that was going to make a big mess, or maybe I wasn't applying it properly, but for whatever reasons this stuff just tended to kind of stick to itself and become rubbery and make a big mess, so I decided to use something else instead. That something else in this case ended up being regular old super glue that I use for quite a few projects actually. And again, as long as we are just looking for a bond, this will do the trick. You do want to be very careful with it because anywhere that glue gets is going to be a big mess, so you really don't want glue going inside the phone. We want something that we can apply it with that's very small. And also, one thing I want to point out here, I had to go back after this repair, open up the phone and clean off the lens, because what happens is as the crazy glue is curing, it's going to fog up the lens. You can go in there later with a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol, probably about a 91% or less, and clean it up, but it's just one extra step that you have. And of course, in order to get to the camera lens, all you have to do is pull the camera out. You don't have to pull the logic board and all this other stuff, but it will be a lot easier just to give the glue a little time to cure and then clean off the lens before you install the camera. So we'll go ahead and set it in here, make sure everything's lined up straight, give it a push, and it should lock right into place. And of course, if anything kind of leaks out, you should be able to wipe it away. Probably the easiest way to remove crazy glue is with acetone, but unfortunately acetone will melt plastic, so I'd want to keep it away from the camera's flash at the very least. But in this case, I just used some rubbing alcohol and was able to get it nice and clean, so you should not have to use anything any stronger than that. Alright, let's go ahead and get our logic board back inside the phone. Now be very careful about not snagging any cables underneath the logic board. This is a very common mistake for people who haven't worked on phones very often. It's very easy to forget one little antenna wire or a flex cable or something else, and if they get trapped under the logic board and you tighten down the screws, you can actually do some damage to those connectors. Remember, they are very, very fragile in this phone. So we've got our standoff screw right down here at the bottom. One over here next to this connector. And of course, this one up here at the top edge of the logic board. We'll go ahead and get this Phillips screw right here. Go ahead and plug that cable back in. And in fact, at this point, I would go ahead and plug in the one down here at the bottom for your charge port. And this is what I meant to get while I was at it, is this other standoff screw. So that way we don't have to pick up that driver again. Go ahead and plug in this cable. And then remember, we have this little thing with the screw and a couple holes in it. And that's going to go as soon as I can get a hold of it. Let me get my good tweezers. Let's go ahead and get a hold of this and set it right up here at the top so you can see where that goes, hopefully. I'm going to start with that screw that kind of sits up on the rail right there. And I don't like to tighten those down all the way. When I have two different screws on one piece, I like to get both screws started to make sure everything is straight. That way, if you need to move it around, it's easy enough to adjust. And then we can go ahead and put them the rest of the way in. All right, plastic cap goes back up here. And then we'll start putting the rest of the screws into that piece. And as I'm sitting here reviewing the video, it occurs to me that the lens on the camera is probably fogging up even though the rear-facing camera is not installed yet. So I kind of wish they would have put a piece of plastic over the inside of that thing to prevent any buildup. But more than likely, by the time you get all your screws into the phone, you're probably going to notice a cloudy sort of coating on the inside of that lens. So if you have a Q-tip and some rubbing alcohol, I would give it a quick wipe down before you install the camera, so that way you make sure you avoid having that problem, because my lens ended up being very foggy when I first put it back together. All right, let's go ahead and get this metal panel back over that cable. I imagine that's there to make sure it doesn't come unplugged accidentally somehow, probably from impact. And of course, make sure that you get your tri-lobe screwdriver. You don't want to take a Phillips to these screws. That can definitely cause some problems. And again, you can see I'm just kind of switching screwdrivers here because so far, all the ones that I've tried have worked, and I have not stripped any screws. So I think it's safe to say that there are probably tri-lobe screws that some technicians prefer or are more comfortable with, or just work better with overall. But for the most part, it seems like they all can do the job. Before you put your camera back in, make sure that you replace this little foam pad. If you don't, the camera's just going to kind of sit there and bounce around a little bit because it doesn't really fill up the area that is designed for it. So that pad is actually there for a reason. It helps to stabilize the camera. So you want to make sure that you put that in before you put the camera inside. And of course, be sure to plug in the camera cable on the logic board. Now we're going to put this little metal bracket back on top. And if you need to, you can, of course, use some tweezers to kind of steady your hand. It can be tricky sometimes to get these screws back in. I'm going to guess that this screw just does not stick to a magnetized bit. So I did have to use my tweezers to set it into place. And that's usually what I do with the previous iPhone models that have that non-magnetic screw. If you just take a pair of tweezers, set it into where you want to go, and then you should be able to tighten it from there. And why is my camera cable unplugged? Because I had to go back and clean out the lens on the inside. Before you plug these antenna wires in, make sure that you do route them into the correct position. right underneath this little metal clip, which is always fun. If you have a good pair of tweezers, it will help. I'm not going to say it's ever easy, but with practice, you'll get faster. And from here, we put the display back on, and in my case, the battery. Close the phone up, and you should be good to go. If you found the video helpful, like it, share it, check out my channel for more tutorials and product reviews, and most of all, remember to hit the subscribe button. Feel free to leave your feedback in the comments section, and thanks for watching.